Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are beaming in from, and thank you for joining this roundtable. I'd like to start by welcoming you all, and then by thanking our sponsors. These are the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at UC Berkeley, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at UCLA. And I would like to thank Nancy Peluso, the chair of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at UC Berkeley, George Dutton, the chair of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at UCLA, and Nguyen Tong at UCLA. And a special thanks to our vice chair, Sarah Maxim, who has helped put together this event at very short notice. We are a research university. People often forget we teach. We are in the 4th week of our teaching semester here. I'd also like to thank the Human Rights Center at Berkeley, the Institute of South Asian Studies at Berkeley, and the Chowdhury Center for Bangladesh Studies at Berkeley, also for co-sponsoring this event. And I'd like to thank our panelists, who I will be introducing shortly, for volunteering their time, their experience, their expertise on this critical matter at such short notice, when they are also engaged in teaching and research at this moment. So, how this panel or roundtable will run is that I will introduce each of the panelists. I will then give a very brief summary of some of the aspects of the coup and its aftermath that we will be addressing today. And I will then field a series of questions to our panelists. This question discussion session and responses from our panelists will last for around 30 minutes. At that point, we will have a brief intermission of 5 minutes to allow our panelists, who may well by that point be not only intellectually and mentally exhausted, but somewhat emotionally exhausted, given close connections with people in Burma, Myanmar at this moment. Allow our panelists to catch their breath, and in that 5-minute intermission, we will be sharing on the screen share some resources from the Bay Area to Burmese news services to sites where you might want to donate or consider other forms of action. And after that intermission, we will reconvene. During that intermission or before, we invite you to post any questions that you have for the panel, and after the intermission, which is scheduled to take place around 1 p.m., depending on how things flow prior, I will then, as moderator, share these questions with our panelists. Okay, so who are our panelists? Let me start by introducing Kenneth Wong, known as Saya Kenneth to many of you, to Ko Kenneth to others. Kenneth Wong was born and raised in Yangon. He left Burma in 1989 to resettle in the US. He has made several return visits to Burma through the years, as recently as 2017. Kenneth is the author of the travelogue A Prayer for Burma, published in 2003, and he is a blogger, a Burmese poetry translator, and a former contributor to Link Asia, a web and news TV channel. Kenneth is also a regular contributor to the Irrawaddy, the Myanmar Times, and the Mekong Review, among other highly respected publications in Burma, Myanmar, and the region. A translator of poetry and fiction, Kenneth has also translated and narrated for the documentary films They Call It Myanmar, Lifting the Curtain, 2012, This Kind of Love, film by Jeannie Hallisey on the human rights activist Aung Myo Min that was screened here at Berkeley in 2015, and is currently co-editor with the poet Coco Tet and myself of a forthcoming special issue of Manoa, the International Literary Journal, published by Hawaii University Press, and that project is funded by the Southeast Asia Council of the American Association of Asian Studies, their Translation Subvention Award, and is slated for inclusion in a University of Hawaii Press National Endowment for the Arts Fund. Here on the Berkeley campus, Kenneth is known as our lecturer in Burmese and is the founding architect of our Burmese language program, which is now in its 5th year at introductory and intermediate levels, and is funded by Title VI via our Center for Southeast Asian Studies. Title VI is a federal grant for which we are most grateful. This year, Kenneth is also one of 12 University of California at Berkeley teaching fellows working on a project, Social Justice and Social Media, raising critical awareness and community engagement among language learners. Thank you, Kenneth, for joining us. Our panelist, Seinenu Lemelson, PhD, is a psychological anthropologist. Seinenu is also a Cal and a UCLA alum. She received her BA in psychology with a highest distinction and high honors here at Cal. And she then received her PhD in psychology with a specialty in culture and human development from UCLA in 2013. Dr. Thein Lemelson is currently a visiting scholar at the Anthropology Department of UCLA and a senior research scientist at the Foundation for Psychocultural Research. She's also a former postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Personality and Social Research at UC Berkeley. A Burmese American, Dr. Thein Lemelson grew up in an extended family that is multi-ethnic and consists of multiple generations of Buddhist, Christians, and Muslims. Her uncle was elected to parliament in 1990 as part of the National League for Democracy and was subsequently held as a prisoner of conscience for 6 years. Her cousin was a student leader in the 1988 pro-democracy movement and held as a prisoner of conscience for 3 years. Seinenu has been conducting fieldwork in Burma since 2008. Journeying back to Burma on a regular basis, both to document the experiences of individuals and families and to engage in community service projects. And she's been conducting an ethnography of the Burmese democracy movement since 2013. Her specializations include trauma, resiliency, political violence, social movements, social media, and more specific movements that we will be discussing shortly. Thank you, Seinenu, for being here with us today. Our third panelist, Hilary Faxon, is on a postdoctoral fellowship here at UC Berkeley in the Division of Environmental Sciences and Policy Management, and first started studying the Burmese language in 2013. She first visited Myanmar also in that year in 2013, and she has worked with Myanmar women's rights and land rights activists, and in 2014 to 5 was a Yale Law School Fellow for Global Justice. Hilary has conducted 30 months ethnographic research on Myanmar's agrarian and political transformations from 2016 to 2019 in rice farming villages. She's also conducted participatory action research with activists and has done research interviews with members of government. A human geographer and a political ecologist, Hilary's interests include environment, development, and technology justice, and much more besides, as you will soon hear. Key strands to her current book project, which she is developing here at Berkeley, are the impact of and responses to land reform and agrarian change among both Chin and Burman communities, and the impact of new technologies under the NLD. She's also researching the politics of Myanmar's internet, including work on farmers and diasporic anti-coup mobilization on Facebook. Hilary has published on the grassroots production of state and ethnic territory after the rice frontier in Myanmar's rural northwest, and she is currently editing a special issue on Myanmar's resource frontiers for the journal Geopolitics. Thank you, Hilary, for being with us today. So as you can see from that brief introduction, we have 3 scholars here today from different disciplinary areas, all of whom have extensive experience in and with Burma, Myanmar, with language skills, deeply connected and grounded in the region. And the purpose of this panel, which we collaboratively pulled together in a short space of time from the 1st of February in response to the coup in Myanmar, and in the knowledge that the next few days after the coup would be critical for developments in Myanmar, in the region. Things are changing, as everyone who has joined this panel today will well know, moment by moment. I'm going to give a very, very brief intro to a couple of things before we segue into the question and answer, as in the roundtable discussion, that is. So, the coup of 1 February in Myanmar has been referenced by China as a cabinet reshuffle, a bid for a UN Security Council resolution was delayed for over 2 days. In that window of critical opportunity, Aung San Suu Kyi was arrested. From that moment on, detentions, people going underground, protests, you'll all have seen this on the news. But in that space, from the coup to the eventual release of a statement 3 days later, critical ground and time was lost. And each day, each hour, time is being lost as international actors, states, corporations fail to act. To date, to the best of my knowledge, only Kirin Beer Company, a Japanese company, has made an ethical stance to withdraw from Myanmar within 48 hours of the coup. A Singapore tobacco company has followed suit more recently. It remains to be seen what other corporate actors may do or may not do in response. Within the international community, well, we've seen the partial delayed response by the UN Security Council, the delay pinned on Russia and China, who wanted to apparently bid for time and spend more time drafting and considering how this resolution should look. To the best of my knowledge, New Zealand is the only country, the only state to have announced that it is terminating investments that will involve the military in Myanmar. And 1 second while I grab my cheat sheet on that. Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, is the first state leader to declare it will cut ties with Myanmar. She's declared she's suspending all high-level political and military contact with Myanmar. The New Zealand aid program to Myanmar is $42 million from 2018 to 2021, not inconsiderable, although it pales in comparison to some of the larger aid programs funneling aid to Myanmar. But she has stated that New Zealand will be cautious about entering into further aid programs in Myanmar from here on, but will continue to ensure that aid supported humanitarian efforts and assistance is delivered to people on the ground, but it will not include projects that are delivered with or benefit to the military government. We've seen already in Myanmar this weekend, the leaders of the coup, that is the hand-picked group of leaders, hand-picked by the military, already meeting with representatives of states in Myanmar this weekend. And there's been some tut-tutting and, oh, we don't think this is good what you've done. But when representatives of states meet with the leaders of the coup, those Zoom chats and images appear in the parallel universe of publications such as The New Light of Myanmar. So alongside reporting on the cabinet reshuffle in China, by way of one example, in The New Light of Myanmar, breaking news might include somewhat less urgent news than you will find reported here in the US, in Europe, in Japan, and outside of those official channels. So why are we here today? We're here today to explore with our panelists, how is this coup and the response to the coup different to well-known prior social movements of protest and military crackdowns, most conspicuous being the Saffron Revolution of 2007, when thousands of monks assembled in protest, resulting in a brutal military crackdown. 1988, when students protested, were brutally repressed. Members of that movement, known as the 1988 generation, what is their role in the ongoing movements and the protests today? 1962, historic coup that established Ne Win as military governor of Burma, the Union of Burma. Going back further in history, and I won't dwell on that much, but student protest movements, nationalist movements, civil disobedience movements, passive resistance movements, spearheaded by monks, by students, by civil servants, by strikers at oil refineries in Burma under colonial rule. There are long histories of protest. Some of these protests have been focused on specific sectors of the population, such as the 1988, which in our minds, in the popular imagination, is very focused on students and student leaders. We're going to be hearing more about the complexity of this demographic from Seinenu shortly. Saffron Revolution, associated clearly with monks. And today's revolution. Sorry, well, it is a revolution in ways. It's a movement, it's a protest. What is revolutionary about the protest is something that has caught both sides by surprise. Many people had been building up trust in the military, at least as a form of slowly developing civil society. The leader of the coup, General Min Aung Hlaing, and others within the military, the Myanmar military, as will be well known to those here, are facing charges of genocide in The Hague, have been conducting a vicious campaign involving grave human rights violations and crimes against humanity. The official verdict is yet to come. This ongoing genocide against the Rohingya has further polarized the population within Myanmar. Burma, the National League for Democracy Party, the party headed by Aung San Suu Kyi, nonetheless won a landslide victory in the elections of November, a landslide victory. So why did I say both sides have been taken by surprise? The swiftness of the action of the military, of the leaders of the coup, within days of their having first said they might take action to defend the constitution and that they would not take action, the swiftness of that action and the way in which they moved to arrest and detain, to unlawfully arrest and detain lawfully represented politicians and leaders, shocked even those who are veteran politicians and resistance figures in Myanmar, Burma. But equally taken by surprise, it seems, was the military. Oh, excuse me, I'm not feeling very well. Okay, I'm sorry, just taking my breath. Okay, so equally taken by surprise was the military, and that is because it seemed to be that they felt that if they arrested Aung San Suu Kyi and if they arrested and detained members of the National League for Democracy and elected representatives, that that would solve the problem. But it hasn't, because students, workers, doctors, teachers, members of different ethnic groups are joining in these protests across the country. And unlike the Saffron Revolution, the Saffron Rebellion, which was concentrated among and started by and spearheaded by monks, this movement in its social spectrum and ethnic spectrum in some ways is almost reminiscent of the broad movement against the British colonial powers. So I'm just going to leave it at that for now. And I'm now going to invite our panelists to speak. And I am going to find my other question sheet, which is lurking here. So I've just mentioned briefly leadership and the leadership of both the coup and the leadership of the protest movements. Seinenu, you have been studying and researching for many years the 88 generation, the National League for Democracy, and also the Union Development and Solidarity Party, or the USDP. In much of the discourse about the coup and its aftermath, there's been a lot of focus on General Min Aung Hlaing, and on Daw Aung San Suu Kyi. And recently, in fact, I think yesterday, George Mo published in the Irrawaddy a commentary. George Mo, incidentally, was a former visiting scholar here in the School of Journalism at Berkeley and is lead English editor of the Irrawaddy magazine. And in his op-ed or commentary, he said that it was almost an insult that everyone is billing this as a personality clash or a struggle between Aung San Suu Kyi and General Min Aung Hlaing. Seinenu, could you tell us a little bit more about the scope and the extent of leadership on both sides?
Yeah, so thank you so much, by the way, Penny, for organizing this, and and over the many years for supporting both Burmese and Burmese American students So this has been very thoughtfully organized, and thank you so much for letting me participate in the conversation. I think one of the main things that needs to be done is that there really needs to be more of a dissemination of who the National League for Democracy is, what the democracy movement is, because despite being in office, being actually having won a majority in 2015 and having been placed in office from 2015 to 2000 up until the coup, essentially, it's still very much a community that's a subaltern history, right? So the vast majority of the research on Burma, of the academic discourse on Burma, of the journalistic discourse on Burma, of the op-eds that we read are primarily a military history. It's a history and an account of Burma that focuses on military subjectivity, on the sort of the agency and thoughts and the culture of the military and their motivations. And so I think Aung San Suu Kyi is focused as part of that, and part of what gets recapitulated in the discourse is the military's talking points about Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD, which is that they are illegitimate. So I'm going to do a little bit of a review, not just of the democracy movement and the National League for Democracy, but to really understand this coup as being part of really a pattern of systematic persecution and violence inflicted on a single identifiable political community. Right, so this is a systematic attempt to eliminate the culture and people of this political community, right, of this political group, in particular the National League for Democracy. This political community consists of many coalitions and many groups. The main one, the biggest one, is the National League for Democracy, but they're all a single community. They consist of one community. So what's happening now, people always reference 2008 because that's when the military locked up all its opponents and wrote the Constitution. A key date to keep in mind is not 2008. The key date to keep in mind as both sort of a way for us to understand what's happening now is 1990. That's when the 1990 elections took place. Shortly after the 1988 uprising, the military allowed free and fair elections, right? And they didn't interfere with it. They interfered in many ways, but it was, when everyone went to the ballots, by all accounts, people cast their ballots and they counted them up. And once again, the NLD won by a landslide then, right? This nascent social movement, they had just formed this political party with Aung San Suu Kyi. And what happened? So in 1990, they won, the NLD won its first of 3 landslide victories against the military and the military proxy party. And all elected officials were rounded up, right? Even before they had the opportunity to take their office. So the initial roundup, just the initial one, included 400 NLD, including all elected members of parliament. That was when my uncle was arrested, illegally detained and arrested at the time. They came and got him in the middle of the night, put a hood on his head, tied him up, took him away. So this was like sort of a form of kidnapping, right? So once rounded up, these elected members of parliament were then systematically tortured, interrogated, and eventually given lengthy prison sentences, some up to 20 years. So when you look at in the NLD Central Executive Committee, a figure like Dr. Zomyat Mao, right? He was in prison for 20 years, I believe. It may have even been 21 years continuously, right? And so through the course of their imprisonment, these political prisoners would once again be regularly tortured. They'd be beaten, starved, dehumanized, sometimes put in cages where military dogs are kept, sometimes chained for long periods or used as forced labor. So some of the roads that are built in Burma, the current parliamentarians and in the NLD administration were actually used as forced labor, chained and forced to build those roads. And many perished during this time, right? And others, it wasn't just elected members of parliament or ministers of the NLD that were rounded up and put in prison and tortured. There were others from this exact same political community that were also rounded up and imprisoned. So you had them go through and arrest all the main leaders of 1988 and everyone who was known to have visibly participated in the student movement in 1988 were also systematically rounded up, arrested, tortured, and then imprisoned, right? So some of the forms of tortures that they would use sometimes involved electrocuting organs implicated in reproduction. It involved sexual violence and rape. especially of young college women. So these are undergraduate and graduate students at RIT and the University of Yangon. And sometimes young women died from the wounds sustained from this sexual violence, and not a dissimilar way to the sexual violence that have been described by Rohingya women at the hands of the Tatmadaw. And once again, they also often be used for forced labor, these political prisoners. So, but rounding up and imprisoning, torturing, this wasn't the only tactic that the military and the USDP and USDA would use to eliminate the culture of the National League for Democracy and the democracy movement. They would raid NLD offices, shutting them down. So we've seen this over the last few days as well, where they've been consistently raiding National League for Democracy offices. They just raided the head office of the National League for Democracy just last night, but they've been raiding on many other ones. Sometimes they would detain and torture and interrogate someone simply for renting a room to the National League for Democracy so that they could have an office. They would do this, sometimes they would take the daughters and sons away of people who would dare to rent them a room or offer them a space where they could convene and have a meeting. National League for Democracy supporters were forbidden to even own a photograph of Aung San Suu Kyi or other democracy leaders such as Min Go-naing or any member of any of the leaders of the 88 generation, and people would face arrest if they were caught with a calendar of Aung San Suu Kyi or a photo of Aung San Suu Kyi, right? So they had to sneak it and pass it to each other during this period. And this social movement community, which has a distinct culture, which has their own distinct rituals, were actually unable to conduct a lot of these rituals. Right. So I'm an anthropologist, I study ritual. They were unable to, engage in what were sort of these meaningful commemoration of key dates in their calendar. They would often have to hold these rituals and ceremonies surreptitiously so that the military wouldn't find out, so that they wouldn't be arrested and prosecuted. In anticipation of the 1990 election and thereafter, even after the 1990 elections were over, you had the military at SLORC and USDA and later the SVDC begin engaging in forced relocations, right? And many don't know about this history. From between 1988 and 1991, over 250,000 civilians were forcefully relocated in Yangon. 250,000 forcefully relocated in Yangon. So this is, once again, this is not in Rakhine State with the Rohingya population. This is not in Gayan State. This is right in the capital. So they would demolish neighborhoods. Sometimes they would burn it down. They would illegally seize property. And most of the neighborhoods that were targeted were from the social movement community, right? Those neighborhoods that protested more, that participated more, that supported the National League for Democracy would be targeted for demolition. And that's when you start having these satellite townships in Yangon. For those of you who've ever been there and know that there's all these like strange kind of satellite, that's when those were built. So there's this very long history that's almost never talked about, right? When we hear about Aung San Suu Kyi or the National League for Democracy, right? And I think one thing that we can begin to start considering, and one aspect where scholars can come in, is really, so whether or not genocide can be committed on political groups is actually contested in the scholarly literature, right? So, and this contestation is in part due to the very specific aspects of the Genocide Convention itself, which expressly excludes political groups, right? So, for example, the mass killings that took place in Indonesia in 1965, for example, where it's estimated that upwards of 1 million people were systematically targeted for elimination, are not often referenced as genocide because the targeted group was the PKI, the Communist Party of Indonesia, rather than a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as specified in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. Likewise, the upwards of 2 million people who were massacred in Cambodia between 1975 and 1979 under Pol Pot's brutal regime, I believe the International Tribunal also declared that the massacres of the ethnically Cham and Vietnamese during this period constituted an act of genocide, but those others who simply just belonged to political parties or political affiliations didn't fit this narrow definition of genocide.
Yeah.
So in Burma, although the genocide of the Rohingya has received international attention, there's really been no acknowledgement either by academics, historians, or journalists of this systematic elimination of the National League for Democracy and this very, very specific political movement and social movement community. And really in the wake of this coup, in the wake of these new raids, we really need to start contemplating whether the attempt to systematically really annihilate the culture and community of the National League for Democracy also constitutes a form of genocide. It's certainly politicide, right? And I'm told that there's right now, so before the National League for Democracy and none of these political groups on the ground would ever have membership lists because it was too dangerous. And they were very reluctant to do that, even as they were going through the quote unquote transition in 2010 and 2012. But I'm told that there's probably about 2 million officially registered NLD members, and I'm deeply concerned for them. I'm deeply concerned that Burma is on the cusp of a genocide, a politicide against this group that they've already systematically targeted for the last 30 years. Right. And I can say more about this cultural system of the democracy movement, which I find to be very special, very unique, and very different from other groups inside Burma.
That would be fascinating, Seinenu, especially as both a psychological researcher and an anthropologist, aka psychological anthropologist. But I would also, at this point, love to hear what you might have to say, Hilary, about the grassroots leadership of resistance. You've been working in agrarian and rural communities, as well as with Chin. And I'd be interested to hear from you what's happening at the grassroots level, also outside of the structures of the NLD, outside of political party structures. And thank you, Seinenu, so much for sharing those very harrowing stories.
Thanks, Penny, and thanks also to Seinenu for that perspective. So with this sort of question about leadership and the grassroots, the sort of way I want to frame my remarks is to say that the biggest thing that Americans get wrong about what's happening in Myanmar today is that it's a sort of end of the story of democracy, and it's a story about one person. And so I think that instead of thinking about this as a failed democratic experiment, we need to really think about this is a very difficult moment in a longer history of democratic struggle, which Seinenu has been talking about, and also in this larger effort to build an ethnic federal democratic union. So in terms of the emergence of leadership and resistance movements we're seeing today, we see obviously a huge role for the youth population, Generation Z, particularly on social media, which I know we'll be speaking about. The role of ethnic youth, whose parents and older generation might not necessarily see themselves as aligned with the NLD or the democratic movement, but I think the youth play a really key role in bridging that gap across ethnicities and thinking of a sort of pan-democracy. There's also been tremendous leadership from factory workers. The garment workers unions and workers unions in Lang Thaya were some of the first people out on the streets. And I know that when we think about who we're supporting in the democratic movement and international support, thinking about how to support those workers unions is really key. We also have seen, I think, a really, really hopeful role for the police. Yesterday, several policemen crossed picket lines and joined protesters in Naypyidaw and Loikaw, which is quite a powerful movement. And I think ultimately, in terms of strategy, one of the only ways that I can see a sort of overturn is to pull members of the armed forces and members of the police into the democratic movement at this point. So finally, we see things like the pot banging campaign, which for friends in rural parts of the country who I've been speaking with, who might not be on social media or might be quite nervous to get out on the streets, the pot banging campaign is kind of a great equalizer. You don't need a smartphone. You don't need to read and write or to write a statement. You can bang your pot at 8 p.m. to protest the military junta. I could say a bit about some of the more conservative factions, and I will say some of my current research is looking at farmers' Facebook groups, and I've seen a real schism in support for the NLD and people who are taking content down or being quite cautious to come out in support of democracy. And I think this really gets to historical factors along with forced labor and political torture. There's also been widespread land dispossession. So when we think about what factory workers or civil society who are on strike, or especially farmers, have at stake, given this long history of taking away land and livelihoods, really the stakes could not be higher for political dissent in this moment. So for me, a sort of key set of takeaways for this analytically is that, yeah, I would agree, Penny, with the comments you were making. This is not about a cult of personality. It's not even just about geopolitics, which is often how it's spoken about in the American press. It's about the political economy of land and resources, which I'm happy to speak more about, and also about these really human moments of courage. So my friends in Yangon and in rural parts of the country are not giving up or allowing themselves to succumb to hopelessness. So the message that they wanted me to share today really is to let it be known that they are resisting and fighting back, and we should also not see this as a closed story.
Thank you so much, Hilary. That's really valuable to have those perspectives and for you to share those recent exchanges, which are indeed hopeful. Kenneth, I'd be very interested to hear what you might have to say, in terms of culture and symbolism. One of the symbols of the 88 generation, especially more recently, of Aung San Suu Kyi and her movement, and this is before the earlier elections, whose results were recognized, and that was the freedom from fear symbol, which evolved or referenced a Buddhist mudra, a Buddhist hand gesture of the Buddha for facing off fear. And yet today we're seeing the Hunger Games salute. So could you perhaps say a little bit about that and how the symbolism is working right now?
I think the symbolism of the Hunger Games three-finger salute is quite fascinating. I'm pretty sure that the Burmese dissidents and activists also saw what was happening in Thailand, neighboring Thailand. In neighboring Thailand, when the protesters protested against the army takeover coup, they used a similar kind of symbol, adopting the Hunger Games three-finger salute. So it is already a symbol that is potent, already a symbol that is understood in the region to be the symbol of defiance against military takeover. So it's not surprising to me that that symbol suddenly take on new meanings in Burma as well. You would see that not even the new generation of Generation Z, younger student leaders, using the same symbol on the street, but you would also see some of the NLD members, those who are not yet arrested, not yet in not yet being detained, but those brave remaining members have actually very recently formed what they call committee representing the Pidu Lutto, which is committee representing the parliament, recognizing them as the legitimate representative of the party that won the election in 2020 by a landslide is a very good way to send the message that this is the political entity that was to recognize as the legal representative of the country and not the military's hand-picked interim administration. The symbols works very well in this particular uprising, because it is an uprising of the new era, as the uprising of the social media era. So a lot of the same kind of three-finger symbols of people banging on pots and kitchenware, those are memes that are going viral, and the new battleground is Facebook and Twitter. The new weapons are live streaming of marches that are happening on the ground and the memes that are going viral. Like Hilary said, this is not the end of democracy, but rather this is we're seeing the rebirth and resurgence of a new kind of democratic energy, and it may have started off. The coup may have started off an assault on what the army considered to be the symbolic head of the NLD, the political entity that Dr. Seinenu is very concerned about. But it has now become a movement that cut across all different factors. It includes, now the movement leaders includes actually young people whose take and whose stands on politics are not necessarily the same as NLD. They were some of the young people who were criticized in the past because they spoke up for the Rohingyas, not a popular cause among the conservative Burmese factions, and because they spoke out against NLD's coziness with the army. Again, not something that many people would want to take on.
Thank you, Kenneth, for that. You always shed so much interesting light on developments, and I know you follow them so closely. And in the 2007 Saffron Revolution, something that was both a symbolic gesture and a very long-standing cultural reference was the overturning of the monks' bowl to cut off merit supply. So this is where monks were in protest overturning the alms bowl so that members of the military and their wives could not donate rice, alms, money, therefore cutting them off from the circulation and supply of merit. But the actual term for boycott in Burmese, the term that's widely used for boycott, is also often that term, right? So, Tabeh Malk, there have been protests by monks in Mandalay. There was the arrest of a sayadaw in, where was it? The Myawaddy sayadaw was arrested. A couple of other leaders of the Saffron Revolution were arrested very early on, within a day or two of the coup. I wondered if you, perhaps Seinenu or Kenneth, could speak a little bit to both the possible role of monks in this current movement and something that we and others have talked about a lot. So what are the differences? We often use this cliche, history repeats itself, but of course history can never repeat itself by definition. That was then, this is now, things are changing. But what are some of the key differences between what's happening now and what happened in 2007?
Dr. Seinenu, start.
Seinenu, would you like
you're on mute.
Yes, you're on mute. You need, yeah.
Thank you for that question. So I think it's in relation to this sort of social movement community and these social movements, both in 1988, and there's a bunch of cycles of protest and movements, not just in 1988, but that we often don't hear about in 1996, in 1998, there was a 1999 movement. And then, the next big one that really caught the international attention was 2007. And then of course now, but there are many cycles of protest in between. And the significant thing from 1988 to 2007, and even thereafter, because there continue to be different forms of labor protests, as Hilary pointed out, student protests around education, it was largely the same kind of community, right? That is not bounded territorially, but it's connected to one another, and some of them were actually, Penny mentioned the independence movement against the British. Some of them are the descendants of independence fighters. The biggest example of that is Aung San Suu Kyi, right? So a lot of these, both and there's also a monk movement, monastic movement in 1990 going into the elections, and then when the elections weren't honored. So these are cycles of protest that we were unaware of, right? So when we think about the 1988 uprising, we think about it as an uprising, that it was kind of, it emerged and then it was squashed. That's not the case. The movement continued. It continued in the prisons, and it continued on the ground, underground, out of necessity. And when it came time for the Saffron Revolution, once again, these were some of the sons and daughters of political prisoners from 1988 who were socialized into this community, who had all the repertoires of resistance that they learned since they were younger. And they collaborated with the monks to organize this broad movement. And it was also ushered in, a lot of people don't know that, the very first protest of the Saffron Revolution was actually done by the 88 Generation Peace and Open Society. So this is a group of individuals who had been around since 1988, some of the main leaders of 1988 student movement who came out of the other side of prison after very long imprisonments, 18, 19, 20 years in prison, long stretches in solitary confinement, somehow came out, somehow regrouped, somehow reconnected with one another. So they actually led that first walk, that first march leading up to the 2007 Saffron Revolution. A few months before that, captured right away, given 60-year, 65-year sentences. But this was the first time, and it was their group, the 88 generation, that was networked and had socialized these younger groups. Individuals like Lin Tet-Nai, Pyo Pyo Aung, and also connected to the student movement, the ABSFU. And I think many would be surprised because you think of social movements as these spontaneous things. And when you look at, they're very organized. In 1980, it was also organized. They had multiple meetings about it. They came up with some of the ways to get people out. People often sort of attribute even August 8th, 1988. It's always reported in the news media that, the day was picked because it was auspicious, implying sort of this irrationality to those who organized it. When you ask them about it, they say, well, it was easy to remember. We could get the word out. This was a time when there were not even really landlines in Yangon, right? So eminently rational. And you see some of these same actors and individuals started to put this, the protest against the coup in motion as well, right? So you see people like Minko Nine and Jimmy, who immediately had to go into hiding right after the coup happened because they knew they would be coming from them, but sending out these almost like Orwellian, it's like out of 1984, Minko Nine sending out these messages on video that he records while he's in hiding. Jimmy was doing the same thing. Nay Ponlet, who's a big, who was actually at Berkeley for a little bit, and he's a big internet organizer. So all of these individuals are still coordinating with one another, but there's this exciting new component, which is Generation Z, right? And they're also participating. And I think one thing that we have to keep in mind is that on the one hand, these social media, these social movements that are centered around social media and based on social media, they're very exciting. And we can all see it unfold. We couldn't see what was unfolding in 1988. It was all underground. It was all secret. That's why someone like me has to go back and research for 7 years what exactly happened, because they couldn't expose themselves, right? They just couldn't risk it. So this social media campaign we're seeing, and it's very visible, but you have to keep in mind that the Arab Spring was the same way. And people were very hopeful with the Arab Spring. Right? And they called it the Facebook revolution and the Twitter revolution. And all the Arabs, thus far, all the social movements of the Arab Spring, apart from Tunisia, hasn't really worked out, right? And so there's going to be certain qualities that are exciting and that are sort of that offer hope in relation to these new social movements that do play out on social media, but there are also very specific qualities of the democracy movement that was almost the opposite of the qualities of social movements that are centered around social media that actually worked for them. So one main aspect was that they had closed networks, right? And when we think of social media and Facebook and Twitter, you have these sort of unending sort of networks of people that you can connect with, and it feels very democratic and open-ended. But when you're being persecuted, when your lives are at stake and there's a military government monitoring everything you do and you risk imprisonment and torture, you want to close your network off a little bit, right? So that was very adaptive for them, right? Yes. Their social movements, those that play out on social media, tend to be leaderless, and the democracy movement, but the leaderless, that has its trade-offs as well. So right now there's this component of the civil disobedience campaign there, where people are just running around doing different things, and it's actually very difficult to coordinate. It was very useful for the democracy movement to have that one leader model, and they decided it was like a rational decision that the leadership made to have a one leadership model. So right after I'll just tell this one story, I know I'm talking too much. Right after the 2015 election, immediately after they had won, everyone was out on the street celebrating, right? And then there was some concern that the military was very upset that there might be another coup, something might happen. And one word came out from Aung San Suu Kyi, that people should just go home and celebrate privately, essentially. Don't make a big deal out of this win against the military. And within like an hour, the streets were cleared. Amazing coordination, right? Amazing discipline. And you may say, well, that doesn't sound quite well. It worked. That's how they were able to sustain their movement for 30 years.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that
There's
story.
other qualities I can talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting because discipline is a key word in the latest announcement, or as last time I checked, latest announcement by the leader of the coup, General Min Aung Hlaing, and his long discourse ended with focus on how it was really all about discipline and the need for discipline. Clearly, there are different generations at play here with General Min Aung Hlaing on the verge of retirement. There has been speculation that that is why he launched this coup now or on February the 1st. And the stakeholders for those who are taking the streets, I mean, they're willing to risk losing their salary, losing their jobs, not to mention losing their life. And yet at the other end of the spectrum, from students, civil servants, you might be on $300 a month and much, much less. There are massive resources and holdings, not only land, and I'm going to ask Hilary to come in and talk about this in a sec, but of course, jade. I mean, Naypyidaw, the political capital, for 2 weeks every year shuts down for the jade emporium. So there are natural resources at play, obviously the oil deposits, and so on and so forth. But Hilary, I'd love you to talk more about the political economy and what's at stake here, both for those who are leaders of the coup in terms of what they might be fearful that they will lose in terms of actual land rights or not, as in what's been going on with the dispossession of lands and land grabs, and what are farmers and rural activists, what are they most fearful of now? And also most hopeful. I shouldn't be focusing on fear all the time, but what are the hopes and fears? Thank you. Well, whatever you can bring to that, I'd love to hear it.
Thanks, Penny. I think that this is a bleak perspective. If my first comments were more hopeful, I think thinking about the political economy of land and resources and the hyper concentration of wealth within the hands of the military elite really give us a serious moment to pause about what we could do to reverse this coup, both from the perspective of folks on the ground who are calling for and enacting a general strike, and also from the perspective of Americans who are calling for targeted sanctions. The fact of the matter is that since the Ne Win coup in '62, and especially after in the 90s and the 2000s under authoritarian rule, there has just been a hyper concentration of land and resources in the hands of a few military elite, and also in some cases in the hands of ethnic militia elite. And what this means is that what sanctions can do and what a general strike can do, unless it's in the jade mine, is quite limited in terms of seriously making the Tatmadaw hurt and making the Tatmadaw economically vulnerable to the ramifications of their actions. Maybe one quite hopeful thing that I've seen in the last few days are these strikes of 5,000 workers at Myanmar Economic Holding Limited jade mines, which are jointly owned with China in Sagaing. I think that, or sorry, not jade mines, copper mines. I think that these sort of strikes at major mining or investment operations, particularly if they're operated between the military and China, perhaps offers a leverage point here. But in terms of the Western audience, I think it's really important to bear in mind that the West makes up just a tiny fraction of Myanmar's economy, a tiny, tiny proportion of aid to Myanmar. Japan is by far the largest aid partner. So what we can do in terms of withholding economic support is quite limited. I think a smarter approach is to be very smart about where our money goes and to use that money to support activists and dissidents at this time, and not to engage with Myanmar military companies.
Yeah, thank you, Hilary. That's really helpful. And of course, while states wait to take action, consumers can also consider choices they might make. For example, when filling up a gas tank, or buying shares if one has those resources at their disposal. I know that Chevron is in a major joint venture with Myanmar military, Total oil company in France, ditto to the best of my knowledge. And that brings us in a way, if obliquely, to Telenor, Norwegian telecommunications provider, as well as Twitter, Facebook, and back around to social media. And so, yes, closed networks under Aung San Suu Kyi, 2015, the word is given, in an hour, everyone's off the street having private parties. But the internet is very interesting because in 2012 in Myanmar, the Bureau of Censorship was shut down. The end of censorship was declared. The internet is wonderful for spreading news, communicating, connecting. It's also a user pays surveillance system because all of these records of transactions, interaction statements are there. If you think of Mao Zedong's, let 100 flowers bloom, 1,000 schools of thoughts contend. Well, if there'd been social media, wouldn't have had to go to that bother because it's a, incredible tracking system. So, and then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got Rihanna tweeting now about Myanmar, and she's been tweeting about what's happening in India with rural protests alongside Greta Thunberg. So, there's so much to unpack there, and I'm the last person to be able to do so because I don't really do social media. So I'd love to hear from you, Kenneth, Hilary, and Seinenu, your thoughts on this big topic and a very open-ended question.
The thing that I noticed recently is that the moment the military decided that they are going to they're going to ban the use of Facebook, suddenly all the activists show up on Twitter, and then my Twitter account start to get dozens of requests and pings, and you definitely notice the immediate switch. And also the VPN battle. Now that the government is trying to stop people from going onto social media, people suddenly become expert at using VPN. I'm not even an expert on how to use VPN, but my Burmese colleagues and peers have figured out how to use the VPN. So in the morning, they'll sign on pretending to be a Singaporean youth, and in the afternoon, they'll come back as a Taiwanese youth so that they can continue to proliferate their message on social media. The army, I think, of course, as the power that controls the infrastructure, as the power that currently by force manages everything, certainly has the ability to, for example, ban people from using the internet and things like that. But I think they're also limited in what they can do with that, because the army itself also used Facebook to monitor where the protesters are going to be showing up. So the strategic command decisions that they need to make also depends on the internet and the social media, just like the protesters also use it the same way by informing one another. There are barriers here and there are barriers there. So today, don't go to Shuego, don't go to Ledan. The internet cut both ways. I think it is used, and it is used to its most efficient fashion by both sides. So it would be, you can worry that the army might actually ban the internet, but I think they can only do that so much because they also rely on the internet and the social media for what they need to do to suppress the uprising.
Thank you, Kenneth. And then just one quick last mention, it's referencing back to Hilary's mention of how some police are crossing the picket lines. Since the 2015 elections, holding 25% of the seats and holding key ministries, the military Myanmar, the Tatmadaw, has been able, it seems, to continue to concentrate and expand its resource base. And the Tatmadaw, that is the army in Burma, has quadrupled in size, not since 2015, but since the last 40 years or so. There's around 500,000 members, including active servicemen and women, including staff in hospitals, schools, and other institutions. But clearly there are, different generations within the military, and there are interconnections too within households. So that's something that maybe that will come up in the Q&A, but we now have 12 questions sitting in the Q&A. And what I will do now, it's 1:08, I'm going to shut this, well, not shut it down. We're going to offer our wonderful panelists a brief intermission. Everyone's going to catch their breath, and we'll reconvene at 1:13, 5 minutes, and we'll take your Q&As from that point onwards. Thank you so much for being with us and staying with us. And we do hope that you will stay for the Q&A. There's still much to discuss. We have 21 questions, and I'll start with the question from Robert Anderson, who's asking us to discuss the positions of the official Sangha, which reported to the minister, and the unofficial networks of next generation leaders in various monasteries. So bringing us back to that question, which we touched upon, but didn't fully explore. Monks were crucial in 2007 and 2008. What have their roles been this time? Thank you. And I'll just throw that open to all of you, Seinenu, Hilary, Kenneth. We do have 21 questions, so.
Very quickly then.
Thank you, Koken.
Sure, very quickly. People tend to think, in 2007, the Sangha spoke with a single voice denouncing the military regime. But before the coup, I have a feeling that the political landscape was rather fragmented. You've got the extremist kind of Sangha like Mabata and Wiratu, and then the ordinary everyday Sangha and the monks that every family members would worship and see every day, come and collect alms like that. So the Sangha is not exactly the single monolithic entity that people might like to think as. I have a feeling that in the coming days we will see more and more maroon robes and saffron robes showing up in the protesting lines, because in the morning of the coup, the people who were raided and detained did not include the monks, but in the subsequent arrest, monks were included. And as a result of that, there probably was some sort of hand wrangling and discussion among the monk Sanghas themselves about how to respond. But it seems like we're starting to see the Sangha showing up in the protest.
So just really quickly, if I can. So I don't think we can sort of, the question of the Sangha, participating in protest or not, or I don't think we can talk about that without really talking about the atrocities that they suffered during the 2007 Saffron Revolution, which also is often strangely not discussed very much, right? And it took a huge hit. The Sangha took the entire, it's not monolithic, but the entire Sangha took a huge hit during the Saffron Revolution. I remember being in a village in Burma in 2008, and I went right after, my first fieldwork was actually right after the Saffron Revolution. And I remember being in this village, and I wasn't really allowed to be in this village, but I was in this village. And then, I remember the villagers in the central part of Burma telling me that, there's a monk, every village has a monastery or two, usually just one monastery. They know who the member of that monastic order is, usually one or two monks. They had no idea who was in their village and who the monk at the monastery was. Their monk had disappeared. Right. So there really had been this sort of, after the Saffron Revolution, a really systematic attempt to undermine the institution of the Sangha and bring it under state control in both violent and non-violent ways. And I don't think we can forget about that. So I don't have enough information coming on the ground, and usually, members of the monastic order aren't logging into social media too much. That they have prohibitions against that as well, just in terms of their daily ritual and whatnot. But I would be curious to see if more come out. But I know that they took a huge hit in 2007, and without even really us having a sense of how many lives were lost, or how many remain imprisoned.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Seinenu. Thank you, and it's a terrific question, but I think it's too early to say, too early to know. So. Michelle Zach, I will try and condense this question, but I hope I don't risk, if I miss out anything, please. put in another question. So Michelle's question, and can you each read the question on your screens? Good. So I'm going to read it out for everyone here. I'm hearing mixed signals from Myanmar, from some minority parties who were separate from but still aligned with the NLD. Many minorities were disenchanted with Auntie Suu, Aung San Suu Kyi, and the NLD, but they hadn't formally broken with them. And the NLD takes their support for granted, and that's their complaint. Much as the American blacks say of the Democratic Party in the USA. So I am going to read the whole question, it's very interesting. In a country made up of 40% minorities, this coalition has frayed seriously in the years of NLD rule. So that means the democracy/social movement is no longer unified, with many minorities feeling hung out to dry by the NLD, obviously including the Rohingya, but not only the Rohingya. Do you see the military taking advantage of such fractures in the movement? And is this part of the timing of the coup? We know that some of the hand-picked leaders by the military do include representatives of different ethnic groups. I'm sorry, I'm just adding that on. But. Hilary, Kenneth, Seinenu?
Hilary, go ahead if you have something.
Sure. I, at the risk of condensing a lot of really marvelous questions in the chat, I feel like this issue of the role of minority parties, ethnic minorities, and sort of inter-ethnic elitism is quite a strong theme across the questions. And I guess I would also say I recognize many of the names in the questions, and many of these folks have great perspectives to share. So the questions, thank you, they're very valuable. One sort of message that I want to, I think, say about this issue of ethnic diversity and schism across the movement is yes, of course, like any movement, like the Occupy movement, like any social movement, coalition building across different parties is going to be key to the success. And we are already seeing schisms and differences. The Mon Unity Party had quite a public disagreement just about 36 hours ago when their Central Executive Committee voted to support the junta, and several members of the committee resigned. And I know from contacts on the ground that this type of dynamic is playing out less publicly within many ethnic parties. So I guess what I want to say about this is that, yes, there's definitely schism among and within ethnic and other minority parties. I guess the question for social movement activists is how to work across these groups, which is why, for me, this perspective of ethnic youth is perhaps the most hopeful. And one of the other questions also pointed out some geographic diversity across the movements, which I think is also a major issue. I think the urban-rural divide is also quite huge. So while we've seen social media pictures of protests taking place in provincial towns across the country, those protests are obviously harder to mobilize and harder to get people involved in rural areas. So I certainly acknowledge these difficulties of working across coalitions, and also the very real difficulties, especially of people who have been historically persecuted ethnic minorities, of imagining a space within a sort of traditionally more Burman National League for Democracy-led movement.
Thank you. And that was part of the focus of Ardet's keynote speech yesterday. And I think in your response, Hilary, you've also sort of responded to questions raised by Tawhid bin Kashem about the link between the tactics that the Damodar developed to suppress the NLD and those used to suppress ethnic minorities. Why hasn't there been a stronger coalition? And we have a very interesting comment, not so much a question, by a comment by Porkalu Tor, comparing the treatment of the Karen by both the NLD and the Myanmar military as two sides of the same coin. So there's a really wonderful array of reflections and perspectives and questions in the Q&A. But we do have a question that I want to move on to because it's something that we unwittingly skipped out of the earlier panel. We've been scheduled to talk about it, and it's a question from Vivian, which is, what can overseas Burmese people do to help? And that was part of a question that we touched upon but didn't explore more fully. So we did share the resources in the interval, but Kenneth, Seinenu, do you have an answer to that about what overseas Burmese people can do to help?
Yeah, but before I tackle that, I did want to address that issue of you know, the ethnic minorities vis-a-vis in relation to the Tatmadaw as well as the NLD. I think one thing that's really often not talked about in the discourse is how diverse ethnically both the Tatmadaw and the NLD is, right? And I think that's where we can come on the side of erring on using sort of the categories that are most meaningful to us in the United States or in other parts of the world, this very Western frame of race and ethnicity, and applying it to this situation, right? So I'm not saying that it doesn't matter, but I will tell you that there are Muslim members of the Tatmadaw, there are Christian members of the Tatmadaw. The Tatmadaw is quite ethnically diverse, and the NLD is likewise ethnically diverse. So I don't think we can entirely parse apart, you know, what's happening in terms of the power dynamics entirely in terms of ethnicity. And I think that one of the Tatmadaws, not just the Tatmadaw, but the USDP, right? The USDP and the Burmese military, one of the main ways that they've sought to sort of hold on to their power is sort of this divide and conquer method in terms of you know, making both different ethnicities sort of feel like they're kind of in opposition with one another or in opposition with the National League for Democracy. My experience of the 88 generation of the National League for Democracy, the people that I interacted with for 7 years in very intimate settings and very personal settings in all their private spaces, is that they're incredibly diverse. Most are of mixed descent, like I am. There's a diversity of religions. There's tons of intermarriage. So I don't really see the same type of tension. And I'm from a very, you know, to situate myself, I'm from a very particular background in Yangon, where Yangon is incredibly diverse, right? And I come from a family that has, you know, and you said in your introduction, you know, that has multiple generations of Christians and Muslims and Buddhists, and we all just kind of coexist, right? And you know, so I think I would be very wary of once again, you know, taking up what I think are partially, not entirely, but partially military talking points that are kind of used to emphasize their own hegemony or gain the upper hand, right? So my take is that the NLD is not just Burmese Buddhist; it's quite diverse religiously and ethnically.
Thank you, Seinenu. I will actually, since this has segued back into this discussion, we will get to the question from Vivian in a sec, but I did want to just bring in here, referencing also back to the comment just now, which was comparing, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm shrinking what was said in the question, and for example, the Democratic Party here in the US. I mean, there's all sorts of things happening outside of party structures, and we've got an interesting question from Kurt Mauser and from Christian Gilberti, so I'll sort of try and lump them together. Well, actually, I'm going to start with Christian's, which is, do you think that anti-military protesters will be more successful at garnering international attention if they de-emphasize Aung San Suu Kyi, who, let's not forget, last year in 2020, stood in The Hague in the International Court of Justice and defended the actions of General Min Aung Hlaing, defended the actions of key military involved in the genocide against the Rohingya. Let's not forget that. So it's a very valid question. The question is a strategic question. Do you think that de-emphasizing Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD, given negative media coverage over the past year, again, the negative media coverage over the past year, we've been making distinctions throughout this discussion about what's happening outside of Myanmar, Burma, and what's happening inside Myanmar, Burma. But you know, by re-emphasizing the fight for democracy and a struggle against authoritarianism, even a regional struggle, and we can think here of the Milk Tea Alliance between Taiwan, Hong Kong, Thailand, and now Myanmar's recently been brought into that. So any thoughts on that? Then I'll go to Kurt's question and back to Vivian's. I hope you're still here, Vivian.
There's no question that on the ground among the Burmese dissidents and the protesters, it includes the alliance, the ad hoc alliance. They're not a formal alliance. The ad hoc alliance include both NLD skeptics and NLD critics and NLD supporters. So it seems that at least inside the country, people have been united by the common dislike and common intense hatred of military takeover and military rule. So that unite them. But it's a valid question for the international audience, because Aung San Suu Kyi's image of the human rights icon is a rather tarnished image. But I think we can still support what is happening in Burma if we look at the fact that this is actually, despite how we might feel about NLE's policy on different matters, it is a democratically elected government that has been forcefully removed and overthrown by the army. So we can still support and we can still stand up for the principle of the fact that a party that has been democratically elected should not be overthrown like that.
Yeah, I think it's very important also to return to that point, to keep returning to that point. And I think there has been a little bit of even schadenfreude or gleeful back and forth and chat among some, almost saying, well, Aung San Suu Kyi, she, got what she deserved. I've heard a bit of that discourse going around in different chats. So let's not, go there, and let's again look at what's happening. There's been a coup, there's been the military detention and unlawful detention of lawfully elected representatives of the people. So thank you, Kenneth, for reminding us of that. Kurt's question, quickly, I'll try and be quick. Given that the NLD was established by an ex-commander-in-chief of the Tamador, to what extent can we understand this coup as an intra-elite conflict amongst the Burma political establishment? I mean, that does go back to a bit of what we've just discussed. I'm skipping to the end of the question. The current protests already have gone beyond demands to simply reinstate Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD. So that's a really interesting question. So how far is it going to go beyond those demands to reinstate? And what possibility for radical change do you see in the moment and the movement? And I think that's a great question. What is the possibility for radical change? So thinking beyond the alliances and histories and elite politics. Hilary?
I'll be brief and then let Seinenu say some things.
Oh, great.
I think we have definitely seen a shift in the type of demands, and this is very much in tension with the last question. So I've worked in rural Burma communities where Aung San Suu Kyi, going back to the question of symbolism, is the ultimate symbol of anti-military democracy, and the power of Dasu as a unifying symbol and as a protector of the people and as a hope for Myanmar is not something that I would throw away just because Nick Kristof or Hannah Beach said that she's kind of a jerk. So I think we have to be quite serious about the potential of Dasu as a unifying force within a certain segment, often Burma, often rural, often not particularly radical or progressive, but quite important to a broader movement. At the same time, I'm really heartened by the more radical calls, the more active cultivation of solidarity with Rohingya and other ethnic minority groups, the calls to abolish and rewrite the Constitution. I do think that we are seeing this sort of explosion of possibility in terms of, and a lot of my friends say, this is not about restoration. This is about really creating a valid and true and new and more inclusive ethnic federal democracy. So I'm hopeful for that, but at the same point in time, having spent a lot of time with farmers, I know that this sort of iconography of Dasu is really a powerful, potent force in the democratic movement.
So I think, the question that I would pose is, in this election, why did the ethnic parties and the People's Party and many of these other parties, it's actually not just two parties, there's many political parties, why didn't they perform as well if there's this sort of deep dissatisfaction with the NLD, which is once again a talking point of the USDP and the military, right? Because we would have seen that it really came across, especially with the ethnic parties. So that's something that to keep in mind. So I think in terms of the task that the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi had, starting from when they came into office and even before that. And Hilary mentioned the 2008 Constitution. Well, the 88 generation and the National League for Democracy had all these demonstrations from 2000, as soon as they were released from prison in 2012, they had these huge mass gatherings. They traveled across the country and they tried to build support to amend the 2008 Constitution. The international media did not pick up on it, hardly, right? But this was an effort. This was an all-out effort that they were going so that they would not have to go into national elections in 2015 with this Constitution. The Constitution itself was written when they were all imprisoned. This is something that the Tatmadaw wrote and the USDP wrote. They held these national conventions while their political opponents were imprisoned. So, you know, I'm always a little baffled by why, you know, these types of details about sort of just the historical reality of what happened is overlooked in favor of this narrative that the NLD and the, you know, and you know, is not only Buddhist and Burma, but also conservative and you know, implicated in the 2008 Constitution. It's simply not the case, right? Mm-hmm. So I had one more point and I'm starting to forget it. So maybe.
Right. Well, thank you, Seinenu. I mean, it's always so helpful to have this history, and even things that happened so recently are often forgotten, specifically given the centrality of the Constitution to this debate. But
I remembered my point, if it's okay. And I'll just say it really quickly. And it's that one of the main, the first thing was the 2008 Constitution. The second task that they had before them was bringing a military of 500,000 individuals with guns and tanks and bringing them under civilian control for the first time ever in Burma, right? And, you know, and I really saw no support for that from the international community. So as soon as, you know, the atrocities for the Rohingya have been ongoing through the 1970s, through the 1990s, right? So the first thing that should have been done in 2016 and 2017, when they were once again attacked and this ethnic cleansing and this genocide occurred, was for the international community to then come in and say, well, you know what? This army needs to be under civilian control. We fully support the democratically elected National League for Democracy. We put our weight behind Aung San Suu Kyi. We support this government, and we support that. We demand that this army be put under civilian control. Enough is enough. That's what should have been the unified voice. You know, that's what the international community should have said in unison. Right. And rather than doing that, there are all this, you know, oh my God, Aung San Suu Kyi's a pariah and she's a monster and she's genocidal and she's responsible. You know, you can debate that till the end of time. Right. And I really don't know what it amounts to any other than something that's ad hominem, unproductive. And that's also, once again, recapitulating the discourse of the military. Recapitulating these lines that they've been talking about how Aung San Suu Kyi is a monster and a pariah since 1988. And it's interesting that the international community picked up that strand of discourse, Nicholas Kristof and Hannah Beach or whomever else. It's something to contemplate. It's a paradox. Yeah.
Right, thank you, Seinenu. But to bring it back again, actually, to this current moment, to what's happening and events unfolding now in Myanmar, and I will get on to Vivian's question about how overseas Burmese can act and what they can do. But I have just seen this comment and question by Michelle Zach, which is as this forum was underway, unbeknownst to me, President Biden has just sanctioned military commanders in Myanmar, i.e. not sanctioning the military commanders, but has imposed sanctions on the military commanders, blocking $1 billion in assets held in the US. I think that's a fantastic move because the only kind of sanction that's really going to affect course of action by military commanders, it's something that actually makes a dent in their own pockets. Any practical effect, do you think? Well, I sort of just answered it in commenting, but anybody else want to just comment on that? I think it's a really welcome development.
I saw that press conference just as I was getting ready to come into this talk. I think combined with this kind of highly laser focused targeted economic sanctions, not blanket sanctions, but sanctions taken against the economic interests of very specific members of the high-ranking army officers, plus the internal pressure that has already been created by the very successful and growing civil disobedience movement, the movement that is disabling some of the banking system, the movement that is disabling some of the transportation systems, and the movement that is cutting off the government operations inside. Combine those two combined put incredible pressure, I think, on the coup leaders to reconsider whether it is really in their interest to going down the same path. So overseas people, back to the questions, if they wanted to support, if they are ordinary people like us, they could very simply express their solidarity for the people who are participating, civil servants who are participating in the civil disobedience movement inside the country. And if someone is of a diplomatic level or a politician, they could actually also officially throw their support behind it, show solidarity, and acknowledge the current NLD members formed committee representing the Pidu Lutto, the NLD members entity.
Thank you, Kenneth, for that. We have a few more questions. Greg Butensky, who's asking for us to excuse him for his search for optimism, notices that this coup follows a pattern in Burma, but it's radically different in that, A, just lost the question, the military was already largely in control. So was this a selfish power grab by Min Aung Hlaing? And two, individuals within the country are largely connected with each other and the world is watching in real time, which is obviously a key difference between what was happening in 1988 and in the decades of isolation. Given these factors, do you see a chance that the coup could ultimately fail?
The Burmese protesters on the ground are essentially saying, we're not hoping that the coup would fail. We are going to make sure that the coup will fail. And the UN's chief also said that he's going to do everything he in his power to make the coup fail. And I think we need to adopt the same kind of mentality that we shouldn't think of that as supporting a lost cause. If we think of it like that, we have already lost.
Thank you, Kenneth. That's very, very well said. I think there's every chance and possibility that this coup could fail, and that it also does depend to some extent not only on protesters in the ground and their voices and the risks that they're taking and the choices that they're making. It does also depend on what China is going to do. I mean, Biden's been speaking to Modi. India is one country that has expressed dissatisfaction. Quite clearly, Japan as a major donor could bring pressure to bear, but hurting these key figures where it's really going to hurt them in their personal bank accounts and assets is certainly one way to go about it. Eri Takami has an interesting question comparing, again, the Saffron Revolution to what's happening now in the proliferation of information that links in with Greg's question. Do you think the military government expected this to happen, given that so much has changed? I.e., everyone's talking about General Min Aung Hlaing as a master strategist. Well, not everyone, but there has been a bit of that profiling in media. But was this a massive miscalculation by the military? Well, I've sort of just passed what Eri was perhaps trying to say, or saying very well, actually. Do you think these online efforts, back to Eri's question, will have an impact on what the outcome of this current movement will be? So sort of going back to some of what we've all discussed, but anything else that you might like to add?
I've heard the Burmese journalist Amin Thein wrote an article, and she, in the headline, refers to it as the stupid coup. And I think I would echo that. It's a stupid, ill-timed, ill-advised, unproductive coup, in a sense that, Min Aung Hlaing's family members control, among other things, hotel resorts. You can't really attract tourists to come to your country if you stage a military takeover. Think about that. So it's not really in his interest to do that. But I think it was more driven by his approaching retirement that he probably didn't want to take, and also wanting to have more control over his personal assets and wanting to protect them after his retirement, and a mix of other things, because who knows what it is. But I don't think you can actually sort of think of this as a brilliant strategic move, because in terms of strategy, it just doesn't make sense.
One question from Polly, why is Chevron dealing with Myanmar, China? That would not have happened under President Trump. Well, that's been going on for quite some time. It didn't happen in the last week. Yep. So that would be my immediate response to that. Maiki Mateelski, to what extent could a mass strike, banks, electricity, civil servants do any significant damage to the Tamador's operations? To the actual operations of the Tamador? That's interesting. I'm going to scroll through and read out a few of these that are related. Khmer. My takeaway from the current military coup is that they have been in control since 1962. I am hopeful that the current local democracy movement, in collaboration with the international community, can uproot them once and for all. They need to be dismantled completely for Burma to have a true democracy. And I'm going to, since some of these questions have in some sense already been touched upon or discussed just in the last 10 minutes, there's an interesting question by Namin, which is, what role does the US Burmese student community overseas have in all of this? As Dr. Faxon pointed out earlier, sorry, my dog is snouting around, so if you hear any funny noises. As Dr. Faxon pointed out earlier, the effect that sanctions by the US government and other businesses has on the hyper-concentrated wealth of the Tamador is limited. So writing in local offices and protesting in the US would seem to have a limited impact, fair point. Additionally, the fundraisers for democratic groups in Burma have also been infiltrated by fake ones. I'm not aware of that, so I can't comment on that, either by the military or other scammers. So we cannot reliably help fund the activists in Burma. So this question by Namin, and there was another question earlier, were about what should people do in terms of being circumspect about the quality of information that's being circulated. We saw with what's been dubbed the Facebook genocide, the role that Facebook played in the genocide against the Rohingya through circulation of fake news. So how do we maneuver around all of this, and how can and do we help as students within the university system? Thank you, Namin, for being here, and thank you for that great question.
I will be speaking very soon to the Burmese students at Berkeley and Burmese students at UCLA and Burmese students at Stanford, members of them, so that we can pull together and have some sort of actions or statements of solidarity supporting the student activists that are working to stop the coup inside the country. So that perhaps that is some of the simple things that we can do from overseas, even though we cannot be on the ground and taking the same risks that they are taking.
I think it's going to be crucial for ASEAN to come in, and they really have, my understanding, I haven't really been following it, is that ASEAN really hasn't, the member states of ASEAN have not really condemned the coup, and they're in different levels of sort of military, civilian, organized governments themselves. But ASEAN really needs to kick, so long as this coup continues, so long as this illegitimate sort of coup leaders have put themselves in the position of power where they claim to be running Myanmar, they need to kick Myanmar out of ASEAN, and they need to make very, very clear, decisive action in relation to that. And I think both the United States, the Biden administration, and the world in general have to take really swift, decisive action. The military, what we saw from 1962 to the present day, but particularly from 1988 to the present day, is that they're infamous for kind of delaying these sort of delay tactics where they say that, let's take, 20 years to write a constitution. Let's wait until we have this. Let's wait until we have that. I think this really, if the world really, if the international community is unified, and it feels like it is, that the actions of Min Aung Hlaing and the Tatmadaw and the military and the USDP are wrong. And it's very clear that they're undermining democracy in Burma and undermining the results of a democratic election. They need to take swift action in Burma, opening up diplomatic channels with places with India and China, who are both sort of implicated because they're neighbors. And my understanding also is that I think China is always sort of raised as this sort of specter, but I also understand that Russia was quite implicated in both, as it was in the United States, with the claims of election fraud, and with the USDP and the Burmese military claiming election fraud well before the November elections in Myanmar. And some of that was done in conjunction through social media, trolling and whatnot, from what I understand with Russia. So that's also something that should be of concern to the Biden administration.
I'd like to just jump in and say a few things on a few of the themes that have come up, a sort of like what can be done meta comment. So in terms of what Burmese Americans or Americans can do in this moment, I do think that donating is a huge thing that can be done, and financial needs are only going to grow. I hear the concern about sort of fake news and fake donation, and if one has direct channels, you know, my money is going to direct contacts in Burma to support striking workers and faculty members. And so I would say there are a lot of those needs, and if folks are interested to learn more, they're welcome to reach out to me. But the link that we put in the resources page is a great sort of general place for funneling donations at this time. Another thing that you can do is call your representatives, and Matt Vanker, Nicole Tumong, and Ma Yi have put together a really great document to guide how you can talk to representatives about what's happening. And I believe we'll be sharing that on the website. And finally, if people have experience in other contexts in social movement organizing or civil disobedience movement, I know there's a hunger among activists on the ground for tips and strategizing across contexts. And that's something I'm also planning on working on for our March 9th event. And on the sort of big geopolitics question, I agree with everything that Seinenu and Kenneth pointed out. Those are really astute comments. I just wanted to add a global arms embargo is something that's very important to push for, because ultimately in a country where the Tatmadaw has all the guns, pro-democracy is always going to be at a disadvantage. And also one call I've been hearing among Burmese activists is for the US and other Western countries to reject the visas of the Tatmadaw as well as members of their families. So not just freezing financial assets, which is fantastic from Biden, but also thinking about other ways to target these military elite and their families carefully and strategically to try to make this hurt.
Thank you, Hilary. And to that extent, General Min Aung Hlaing is already under a no-fly embargo, for what that's worth, in the COVID era as of last fall. And so, in fact, he himself personally did not have that much to lose in as much as these kinds of sanctions were already on him. But those are really great points. I know, Hilary, that you're going to be organizing a colloquium. I think 9th of March is the tentative date. And this panel was really put together at very short notice. Anyone who's listening in who teaches will understand that there's a little bit more to organizing a web event. People might think, oh, it's a web event, so what, you just woke up and you got on a panel. It doesn't work like that. So we've done the best that we could in terms of just getting folk together from within the Berkeley-UCLA community, able to volunteer their time and expertise at very short notice. But Hilary is planning something with a longer lead time. And so the questions that you've shared with us, which we haven't all been able to answer, or been able to answer all of them, some of these questions are going to be really incredibly helpful also, I think, to informing your colloquium and kind of what sort of angles you might take. I noticed there's a few questions specifically about the copper mine you mentioned, and these pressure points, what other pressure points can be used. And it's a great thing that you did mention the very obvious one about military aid and equipment. Yeah, that's a good pressure point. I really appreciated Gary Rocchio's question and a comment. The comment is, there's been an increase of visibility of the gay community in Burma. How supportive are the various political groups? When introducing Kenneth, I mentioned this wonderful film, This Kind of Love, featuring Aung Myo Mint, directed by Jeannie Hallacy, that came out in around 2015. And that's also a very harrowing story of the mistreatment and abuse, and in fact, execution of the lover of the main protagonist of the documentary within one of the military wings of one of the non-Burma ethnic groups. So there has been certainly really a growth and expression of this. But I'd love, Kenneth, would you like to say something very quickly about that, or Seinenu, because this will be our last question, but again, ending on a note of hope. How supportive are the various political groups, I hope it's a notice of hope, of the LGBTQ community in Myanmar and Burma? And also by extension, is that group or members of that group playing any particular role in the protest or forming sort of subgroups? Yeah.
So I think there's the transnational sort of gay rights movement, that's what's come into Burma more recently, but there's always been a long tradition of this community, and the biggest manifestation of that is, of course, the Nats and the Nat Gadahs and the Nat festivals. This is largely what we would call an LGBTQ community. They have festivals year round. They have some of the largest I think one of the largest festivals, LGBTQ festival, takes place in Burma in Dangbyo every year. And so this is a vibrant community even before that transnational discourse and the transnational movement came in. Now that it has come in, I think they are identifying, strongly with some of the terms that are used in the transnational community. I know a lot of the activists that I worked with would identify as such, and they're certainly participating in it now. I also saw some photos on Facebook and social media indicating that that they were pledging support of it. So it's one of the the sort of the exciting things about the social media and the movement right now.
Thank you.
Nothing.
Thank you. Yeah.
Nothing bonds people together like going into battle together and fight for a common cause. And what is inspiring, what I'm seeing on social media is that the people who are taking photos with the three-finger salutes and the people who are showing their support for the civil disobedience movements include very public images of the LGBTQ community in big cities in Yangon, and also the Rohingya communities, the Muslim communities. The usually marginalized communities are actually part of this collective movement to overthrow military rule. So I'm hopeful that after this, and it will end well, after this, people will look upon these marginalized community with new light and new appreciation.
Thank you, Kenneth. Well, on that note of new light, not the new light of Myanmar newspaper, I might add,
No.
on that note of new hope and light, let's now close the colloquium, the roundtable, and really big round of applause to Kenneth, Hilary, and Seinenu. Thanks again to Sarah and for Wiat Tong for the administrative support. And we hope that we will see, well, actually we can't see you, but we hope that we will hear from you and that you will follow Dr. Faxon and news about the colloquium that she's planning. And yeah, I think that's it from us. Any final words from you all?
Thank you so much for the chance to be part of it. This is an important issue, and I'm glad that I was able to contribute. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.